JT Wistersill of Locked On Utes. Utah and BYU both own Kansas in basketball. The Jayhawks are spitting, and Utah basketball was an afterthought in the Big 12 for the most part, and now all of a sudden they're up there in the middle of the pack. And BYU basketball a couple of weeks ago was, will they be an NCAA tournament team? They went and routed Kansas 91-57. This is the death of the Jayhawks, who will drop out of the top 25, and the birth of basketball in Utah in the Big 12.
Yeah, you only highlighted Kansas, but I see you back there, Kansas State, too, because they also got their butts kicked, and a lot of people are making a push to try and get them in the tournament. What Utah and BYU both did is incredibly impressive. I will say, I think Utah's a fascinating conversation because their coach is on the hot seat, Craig Smith. Mm-hmm. I think he has a chance to keep his job. That's how big the Kansas and Kansas State wins were for him. Obviously, Kevin Young's fine. He's doing a good job. Yeah. It's his first year, and there's so much that's going to go into next year anyways, too. That's what a lot of BYU fans are waiting for. Even if they want to be successful this year, make the tournament, do all the things of that nature. What does these wins say about these teams? I actually think it says what we've known about them all year. They're really good at home. They're 27-5 combined at home. Utah is 14-3 in the Huntsman. BYU is 13-2 in the Marriott Center. So why do teams struggle to come out to play in Utah? And this actually isn't just a basketball conversation. Most years, it didn't work out so well this year for Utah football because of how bad their offense was. But most years, it's just really hard to come into Utah and win in general, for whether that be for Utah football or BYU has had a very good home field advantage too. What is the reason for that? The altitude is a legit thing there. You see teams get fatigued and worn down. And what happens when you get fatigued and worn down? You make mistakes that are uncharacteristic. Kansas turned it over 15 times against BYU. Uncharacteristic for them because they were fatigued, and it's hard to play in that altitude too. Also, the new travel schedule, that's something that definitely factors into this too, having to make their way out for a long trip in Utah as well too. So look, it just gets really hard. The altitude, to keep the conditioning up, you make mistakes. And I give a lot of credit to Utah and BYU for what they did to Kansas. I will say really quick about Kansas. This comes to us from ESPN. This was Kansas' 7th loss in which they have been ranked and lost to an unranked team, which is their most such losses in the AP era. That goes back to pre-1950. So that also shows you good on Utah and BYU. They're stepping up. They're doing good things right now. Kansas has a legit problem.
That is one of the wildest, that's not even Bill Self. That's every era of Kansas basketball, basically. And even past the modern era, they have somehow they're still going to make the NCAA tournament, but this year, it's like Kansas has hit a wall. Self said in his post-game press conference, we thought this would be a bonding trip. We'll go to Utah for a week, 9 days, whatever it ends up being. We'll find ourselves, and it'll be a fun kumbaya for all of our guys. And then he goes into the presser and says, we all need to get away from each other. We all need to be as far away from each other as possible and end this. Did the state of Utah break Kansas basketball?
I think they might have been the final push. Did other people land the punches and then Utah came in for that big cinematic blow that's going to Utah and BYU to knock them out? I think that is absolutely possible because I just feel like this is a team that's teetering. There's been some really interesting Hunter Dickinson comments throughout the season. He's got that weird deal where he's also a CBS analyst too. So this is a very weird team. And sometimes we see the guys who stay in college forever. Doesn't always end so well. Cam Rising, Alan Bowman, KJ Jefferson. Some of them it works great, but not all these guys it does. So I really do think there's a chance. I think both Utah and BYU are playing their best basketball right now. Now, part of that is they're at home, so I want to see how they're going to fare on the road coming up here. Also really excited for Utah and BYU to face off down the stretch in the regular season final game. That was an awesome atmosphere last night the Cougars had. To Drake, that was just incredibly exciting. I'm sure Jake Hatch was there too. So it was an incredibly exciting atmosphere. I do think Utah and BYU in part have they damaged Kansas badly. And even Kansas State, they were expected to do more. I'm blanking on his name now, Drake, but they had the big transfer from Illinois they got. And he is, I think it's Coleman Hawkins. I want to say it is. And he was struggling for the Wildcats too. So it's wild to see Utah step up and be a team that's Utah basketball, BYU basketball had expectations for Utah basketball to go out and beat Kansas. That's why it's what's wrong with Kansas so much? And it's also wait, Craig Smith's a pretty good coach. Maybe we should keep him in Utah. So it was crazy to watch Utah and BYU be able to pull off the big upsets over the weekend. And BYU thrashed them. I mean, oh my gosh, it wasn't even a game in the second half.
Yeah. Coleman Hawkins. Who? That's kind of what it's felt like in a few of these games here recently. JT, I want to talk Utah basketball, BYU basketball, holy war. It feels a lot less spicy. It feels a little more kind of the vibes that I've gotten so far is like when Utah wins a basketball game against Kansas, BYU fans are going, good. We want Kansas to lose in basketball. Almost like there's a sense of somewhat camaraderie between the two. I could be reading this entirely wrong, but it feels like both schools are okay with each other winning in basketball. Is that true this season at least?
Feels like it. I think the Utah BYU rivalry is very interesting because you mentioned how Bill Self talked about having a kumbaya when they came out to Utah. Drake, you were at the Utah BYU football game. Would you describe that as a kumbaya?
No kumbaya. It's not opposite of kumbaya.
No, opposite of kumbaya, exactly. I do think there is something to be said of the Utah BYU rivalry is so fascinating and complex. We talked about the religious ramifications of it before too. And then you also look at just, I feel like some fans loathe the other school to an unhealthy level. And then some fans look at them like, I'm a Utah fan, but my second favorite team is BYU. So this rivalry becomes so complex and interesting. And with every state that anyone has ever lived in, there's always our state against the world or against everyone, right? So I do feel like there is that thing of, hey, Utah basketball, like Utah high school football was disrespected not long ago. Utah high school basketball is caught in some flat. So like anytime your state's being disrespected, you're going to want the teams in your state to perform, step up, and do some things. And that's what both Utah and BYU have been able to do in basketball. I think to be able to beat Kansas once again, like that's monumental. That's got to be. Utah beat Arizona a couple of years ago, but to beat a true blue blood like Kansas is an incredible feat for this Utah team and an incredible feat for BYU too. So I do. It's not the same as football. What's interesting is there should be the same level of disgust because Chris Burgess, who's an assistant on BYU, he was with BYU a couple years ago. Then he went to Utah. Then he left and went back to BYU, and he took Keita Keita, the center on Utah last year, with the Cougars. So that's still a little bit of a rivalry there. But I have seen a lot of Utah and BYU fans almost just seems like uniting and just being like, this is awesome that we both beat the Kansas schools and knocked them down. So it's all, the football fandom is always a little more intense, I think, just with every fan base. We've seen that in the Alabama Auburn basketball game. I even feel like too, it wasn't at the same level as the Iron Bowl is, but it does feel like with basketball too, that both programs, because they've experienced some down play at times this year and maybe not, well, Utah surpassed expectations, but still a disappointment. I mean, that Houston game was just dreadful for Utah in basketball, and even BYU, they had their rough spots too. So they were both a little bit down, and then they both get a major win. And, so not all the fans are crazy about like their hate for the other school. So I think a lot of the ones in the middle that you see, and I myself included, I can be like, I really like BYU's open on ESPN last night was incredible with their student section, them panning to that. That was a great shot. I have a lot of respect for Kevin Young and the Cougars basketball program. And the intense hatred that sometimes goes to football, it's not there for basketball. It was, like you said, Drake, great week for Utah basketball. Not good for any basketball in the state of Kansas in the Big 12.
No, it was not. JT, where can more folks find your work?
You guys can head over Locked On Utes. Find my personal handle at JT Wisterso, Locked On Utes on X as well. Drake, always great hanging with you, my friend. And also, you are a very handsome host as well.
Thank you very much. That's very sweet of you, JT. This has been and always will be Locked On. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. Dose Grande.